It's time to step up your astrology game. And we're going to do that today by looking at some major things. I'm specifically talking about the YSL court case, Young Thug. If you haven't been living under a rock, you may have seen this. It's a major RICO trial going on in Georgia right now. There's a lot of people involved. And we're going to do this by looking at some electional and horary astrology. And what does that mean for this court case exactly? I'm going to do this in a couple of ways, but mainly we're going to be comparing this major RICO case against an older RICO case, the 1991 John Gotti trial, which is also a major RICO case against the mafia. Obviously, the government won that case. John Gotti was sent to prison. Then we're going to look at one more case against a gentleman named Irving Lorenzo. You may know him better as Irv Gotti. Of course, that was in 2005. His record company, Murder Inc., Ja Rule, Ashante, all of those were on that label. They got indicted. Irv Gotti and his brother got indicted for racketeering, RICO charges. They were accused of laundering money for a major drug dealer. And they went to a long, drawn-out trial. They actually won in the end. They spent a lot of money to do it. So we're going to see what these old cases have to do with this new case in terms of what does the astrology say and what chances do these people have compared to what happened in the past based on what their astrology said. And we're going to do that using medieval and Hellenistic horary and electional astrology. And we're going to use some really old techniques to kind of go through these things. Now, if you don't know anything about electional or horary astrology, you generally need the exact time that something starts. I don't have that in some of the cases here. I only have a date stamp. I've been through the county records. There's a time on some of the files, but actually not on the original indictments. It looks like someone walked into the clerk's office, filed it, stamped a date on it, but there is not an actual time stamp on it. We're looking at this on the initiation date. We're looking at this on the date when these charges officially dropped, right? That is the time that most matters in electional astrology, is when something was started, when the intention was officially put into the universe. Generally, these court cases are filed in the morning, so we're going to assume they were filed at around 9 a.m. That's generally a safe assumption in court. So what we're going to do is look at that. And first, we're going to start with the original YSL indictment. This is a little bit confusing because there's actually two indictments in this case. The first one was filed May 9th, 2002. This indictment went on, I believe, for, all summer. So it was June, July, August. So it went on for about 3 months. Then the government actually vacated this indictment, but they repackaged it into a new indictment. I believe they brought some new people into the case and they wanted to combine everything. So we're going to look at both indictments and what this might mean for the defendants and the government, of course, and see who might come out on top based on what this astrology shows. So first, we're going to take a look at the original YSL indictment. This is the new case that was in May 9th, 2002. Now, when you look at any electional or horary chart such as this, generally, as I said, the time is very important because we want to be looking at the first house and its ruler as well as the moon. And that's going to change things because generally the first house is considered the person asking the question or the person who this is most pertaining to, while the seventh house would be the opposition, or in medieval astrology, in times of war or a legal battle, the seventh house always represents the other person. So one of these houses would represent most likely the defendants, and the seventh house would then represent the prosecution. So we don't have an exact time, so I'm not going to be able to use that as well. I don't think so. But what we can do when you don't have that is we can use the moon. Now, the moon represents the overall situation, how the overall outlook is going to happen in this situation and where it's going. Now, from this original chart, the first thing that's going to stand out to us, I believe, is the moon is in an exact opposition with Saturn, considering that this was probably filed at, 8:39 in the morning. If it was a little bit later, the moon might be separating, which would give these people a little bit more luck. But as it is now, this is a very, very heavy drag on the moon. Obviously, there is an exact opposition with Saturn. That is so rough. That means that this is detrimental. Okay, Saturn is always going to be detrimental in electional or horary astrology. It represents things that are completely blocked, they're completely stuck. So this might be the time that they threw these people in prison as well. So that's actually pretty accurate. And what we're going to do then is we're going to switch gears and we're going to look at the next chart, which is, I believe, August 5th. So we're going to switch gears and look at the August 5th re-indictment in this YSL case. As I said, this is when the prosecution vacated the old indictment and actually presented a new one, I believe, with some new defendants. It was mostly the same charges, but they may have changed a few things here and there. Now, what sticks out in this one, obviously, again, we have the moon in an exact opposition with Mars. I see this a lot when I look at the astrology of police, when I look at the astrology of courts, when I look at the astrology of, anything that has to do with a intense legal battle or some kind of police battle, you will see a lot of Mars. So the first thing we'll notice as well is the moon is in Scorpio. Scorpio is the sign of the moon's fall. So immediately the moon does not like being there. This is very rough for the moon. The moon is saying, why am I even here at all? I do not like being here. This whole thing is a major, major drag. So considering that, if we're looking at this from the defendant's point of view, this whole thing is very, very rough, right? This has been going on already. This was 2022. This case has been going on almost 2 years. So this is a major drag, right? And we can see that in this astrology chart because the moon is in Scorpio and it's also opposing Uranus and it's opposing Mars. So I think that's what we're getting to now. Generally in horary and electional astrology, a fixed sign like Scorpio will represent things taking a little bit longer in terms of years. This isn't something that's going to get resolved quickly. So I think that this 2-year mark that we're coming on now is actually very good for the astrology representing that. And in terms of the moon being in a fixed sign, Mars being in a fixed sign, war, police, action, aggression, fighting. I believe there's some murder cases in here. So there's a lot there, right? And the moon is opposed to Uranus, which means there's going to be a lot of unexpected twists and turns in this case. And I think we're seeing that now. And we're definitely getting a hold of that. And I think what's coming next is after this portion, we're going to see this opposing Mars start to kick in. And I don't like to say it because I have watched a bit of this trial and I think that there's a lot wrong with it. I think that this trial has a lot of grave errors. I think it's probably going to end up getting appealed. I do think the state's going to win. I'll just tell you right now, based off of this chart, because what I'm seeing here is that this has been so drawn out, but the state does win because of this Mars opposition. But I'm not saying there's not room for an appeal, because we are also going to see that. Or if you'll recall, the first moon was squared Saturn as well. This moon is also in a Saturn square. But first it's going to hit Mars, right? Because this is at an earlier degree. This is at 20 degrees, almost 21 degrees. Uranus actually, it's even earlier. This is at 18 degrees. And the moon is just separating from the sun, right? So the sun and the moon here, this should be about a first quarter moon. And that's when things are just starting to bloom. They're starting to pick up. You've taken the initiative from the full moon and now you're picking up and you're doing something with it. And I think that what we're seeing here, we're seeing a lot of intensity and a lot of going back and forth. There's this action is never stopping in this case. Now we also see the moon, as I mentioned, in this Saturn square, but first it's going to hit Uranus and Mars in opposition first, and then we will square Saturn, but we're also going to make a trine with Venus. I think this Venus trine is most likely going to be an appeal. I think that there will be some luck for the defendants here, at least some of them. This is a RICO case. There's a lot of people involved. So I do think that some of these people will be exonerated. I can't exactly say for who based off of this chart, but I think that a few of them will be exonerated. And again, generally when I see this much friction against the moon, especially with Mars and Saturn, it's a very good sign for the prosecution. It's a very good sign for the police and jails because the police are represented by Mars. The police are represented by, Pluto as well, but mostly Mars in traditional astrology, because Mars is a sign of aggression. It's a sign of violence. It's a sign of, having to use physical force, which is a daily part of a police officer's life or, a jail guard's life. So we're seeing a lot of that. So for that reason, I do think that this is in favor of the prosecution. And one last thing I haven't mentioned yet, but I have had my eye on it, for those of you that are also horary experts, Mercury is in Virgo. This is an excellent position for initiating a court case, right? We're looking at this on the initiation date, and we're seeing that here. Mercury is in Virgo. Mercury is very happy in Virgo. Mercury in Virgo is excellent for presenting a detailed analytical court case, okay? I also think this could be good for the defendants. I think that from what I've seen, the defense is doing an excellent job. I just think that the way the rest of the chart looks, that this is more in favor of the prosecution at this time. Now, for comparison, we're going to look at the actual John Gotti trial, which began July 18th, 1991. That's when the Gotti indictment was filed by the government in, I believe it was the Eastern District of New York. So comparatively, in this case, there's a few things that stand out as well. The first one being Mars and Venus are basically conjunct. So to me, this tells me there is a lot of love-hate going on. And if you'll recall, at the time, John Gotti was very popular. A lot of people liked John Gotti. He was famous. He was the Dapper Don. He was a man that was respected and loved by his community. And a lot of people didn't agree with what the government were doing to him. A lot of people said that this case was a farce. Very similar to what's going on now in this case. A lot of people think that this YSL case is a farce. But does that matter according to the astrology towards the end result? So let's look here. John Gotti trial. This was July 18th, 1991. We have Mercury in conjunct with Jupiter, which is very good for Mercury. Again, Mercury is going to represent documentation. It's going to represent court filings. It's going to represent things like that. Now, what I notice here is that the moon is starting to separate from it. The moon's at almost 25 degrees Libra. Mercury's at about 21 degrees Leo. So the moon is beginning to move away from its aspect with Mercury. So it's not as powerful here, I don't think. Generally, that's when that's moving away from. It represents things that are departing, represents things that are getting weaker, right? So maybe that has to do with how the strength of this case, but it didn't really matter to the outcome. Now, why is that? In terms of the moon, again, just looking at the moon here, because the moon is very powerful for the overall situation. So the moon is separating from this aspect. It's in a square with the sun, which I think can represent a lot of ego. It can represent egotism, I think. Again, this is in a first quarter moon phase, interestingly, exactly like the YSL charts. After that, the next aspect that the moon makes is actually with Saturn again. So when the moon leaves Libra, now in the last one we saw the moon in Scorpio, and this one the moon is in Libra. So this is a tropical sign, which generally things happen a little bit faster. This case didn't go on nearly as long. John Gotti was indicted or sentenced, I believe, not even a year later. It was like 10 or 11 months later. The trial was actually, it was a longer trial. There was a lot of witnesses involved, but the jury found him guilty pretty quick. And I think we're seeing that here as well, because the moon, its very next aspect is in a Saturn square. Now, again, if I had the exact times for some of these, I don't have the exact time for the old Gotti indictment in 91 either. I couldn't find that record. If anyone does have the time that was filed, I would definitely appreciate it. So we're just going by dates here. So this isn't 100% accurate horary astrology because I would need the exact time. We're going on a more general feel from what the aspects are showing, and especially the moon, which is a major factor in horary and electional astrology. Now we're going to look at the trial of Irv Gotti. Irv Gotti won this trial. The government prosecuted him and his brother under RICO charges with a drug dealer. They accused their whole record label basically of being this front for drug dealers to launder money. And they spent, I believe, upwards of $10 million fighting this case. A lot of money fighting this case, and they won. They won, free and clear. So how does this look comparatively to the other cases that we were looking at? Now, the first thing we'll notice, Mercury. Mercury is also in a good aspect with Venus. So again, I think, Venus is a benefic planet. Mercury is in Capricorn, implying a lot of, detail. However, Mercury is just leaving from an opposition with Saturn. So again, when something is leaving, when something is separating from an aspect, such as this, Mercury's at 24 degrees, Saturn's almost at 23 degrees. They're very tight, but Mercury is just starting to say goodbye. So I think that there were probably a lot of errors in this case, because again, Mercury is going to represent the actual paperwork filed. It's going to represent, how much detail that was put into these cases. And with that Saturn opposition, I think right there, it's showing that there was probably some errors in filing this whole thing. Now, another big thing that's going to stand out for me is the moon again, right? We're going to take a look at the moon. It's at 18 degrees Leo, and it is in an exact sextile, 1845 for the moon, 1847 for Jupiter in Libra. So we have an exact sextile. The moon is extremely happy. It's sextile a benefic planet like Jupiter. Jupiter again is going to represent, victory, luck, joy, community, friendship, money, anything like that. But mostly, and I think in a case like this, it's going to represent victory. And we see the moon here in a good sextile aspect with Jupiter. So to me, that's saying, yeah, they're spending some money, they're making some friends, and we're going to get a good outcome from this. That's the first planet that the moon is applying to, right? It's the very first aspect it's making. The moon hits Jupiter first from 1845 to 1847. And then, even if this time is not 100% right, the moon is also hitting a trine with Mars, right? Now, again, Mars, I think, is going to represent the legal system. It's going to represent jails and police and guards and contention and very abrasive court cases. Now, the moon's actually in a very harmonious aspect with Mars. So they're getting along here. The moon is happy with Mars. They're saying that, this thing is going to be resolved amicably for all sides. And I think that's what happened. I believe the government actually did end up attempting to give them a deal. And they turned it down because they knew the whole thing was it was bullshit. They knew it. So they turned the deal down, went to court and won. And they did a very good job. Their lawyers did great for them, and they won. And I think the astrology shows that here. The moon is in a great position with Mars. It's very happy. The moon is in a great position with Jupiter. There's a lot of harmony. There's a lot of luck happening. And I think with this moon Mars, it's basically like the legal system is operating, but it's like, we're going to let them go. All right. And they did a very amazing thing here, considering the government wins 98% of their cases. The government completely botched this case, and their lawyers pulled through and they won. I think the astrology actually shows that in this chart as well, in terms of what just the aspects are on when this happened. This is even without the time. Now I can get a lot more specific if I have the exact time. So guys, that's just a quick breakdown of some horary and electional astrology in terms of the legal system and the judicial system. Again, I don't really have an opinion on this case either way. I do think a lot of it was botched from what I've seen. I haven't watched the whole thing. I think that there will be in this YSL case people that, a lot of them that do actually go to jail. There is a very strong push towards that in the astrology. I do think a few of them will probably walk, maybe one or two, based on that moon trine with Venus. However, if the government appeals, if the people appeal and there's a lot of drawn out process to this, I don't think it wins. I think that the courts will find some legal theory to keep them in prison. So guys, let me know if you have any court cases coming up, what you've noticed in terms of electional or horary astrology, or what you'd like me to talk about in terms of electional and horary astrology next, because I do have a lot of experience with this subject. So yeah, definitely let me know what you guys think, what you're seeing. If you have a different opinion, let me know. Absolutely. So guys, make sure you comment, like, and subscribe, and it will definitely encourage me to keep making content like this.